in the Pacific Northwest, salmon is, of course, popular food for humans and the orca population. But with the orca's sole food source of Chinook salmon getting smaller and smaller, we're asking if it's still a good idea for humans to consume this fish. Here with insight is Professor Ray Hilborn from the University of Washington School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences. Welcome.
Good morning.
Let's start first of all about the varieties of salmon that we eat around here. What are they?
Well, there's 5 species of Pacific salmon in the United States, and generally the most preferred is Chinook salmon. It's got the highest fat content, followed by sockeye, then usually coho, and then pink and chum, which are not particularly popular for people in the Northwest to eat, but are eaten in a lot of the world.
And Chinook and king are the same thing?
Chinook and king are the same thing.
Okay.
That's right.
Are there certain varieties of the ones you just mentioned that we should be avoiding as humans?
Well, it all depends on for what? For health reasons?
No, not for our health, but for their sustainability or for other food supplies for populations like the orcas.
In American fisheries are well managed and sustainably managed. So the only reason somebody might say, oh, I shouldn't eat, and particularly Chinook salmon, is because orcas also eat Chinook salmon, and there's a lot of concern that orcas are not doing well.
Right.
Some of the possible explanations are declines in the abundance of Chinook salmon. But the 2 issues are, one, if you don't eat a Chinook salmon, someone else is going to. That you know, everybody in Seattle could stop eating Chinook salmon and it wouldn't change how many Chinook are caught one bit. They would simply go to other markets. So not eating Chinook salmon as a choice to save orcas is a personal feel-good, but it's not going to change the situation.
Okay. You mentioned well-managed fisheries. Tell us more about that, and is there any way for me as a consumer to affect that or know that or support that?
Well, it's done by governments, although in Washington there's also co-management of some of the salmon with the Indian tribes, and the track record is generally good. There's really very little overfishing. I mean, the salmon are not in good shape, but it's not now really because of the harvesting. It's because of the historical loss of habitat, dams, but also ocean conditions, that things have just got worse for lower 48 salmon since the late 1970s. And
Wow.
there's really, other than climate change issues, you know, there's nothing that we can do about it.
How do the environmental impacts of producing fish compare to producing other kinds of meat, cattle and whatnot?
I'm really glad you asked me that. In general, fish look very good compared to almost any kind of livestock in terms of carbon footprint, but also in terms of habitat destruction. You know, we can harvest salmon and harvest most fish when well managed with very little overall impact to the ocean. But if you want to grow crops, and my son's a farmer, I know it quite well, you chop down a native ecosystem and completely destroy it. You take a northwest forest and you turn it into a cornfield. So in general, fisheries have quite a bit lower environmental impact than crops, and I mean than livestock. And even with respect to crops, many fisheries look very good compared to crops.
Explain why cattle take up so much from the environment, because we don't, you know, typically we think, well, they're grazing, what's the big deal? But explain why that's a thing that has such impact.
Well, the big carbon footprint issue of cattle is their ruminants. That is, their digestive system uses bacteria that produce methane. So they produce a lot of methane in the form of manure, in the form of farts, in the form of burps. That really is something that, say, chickens and pigs don't have. So that's why cattle typically look worse than chickens and pigs. And the other is food conversion efficiency, that most beef and pretty well most dairy in the U.S. are fed crops that are grown. They're not grazing there very much. So my son has 2,000 animals, and they're not on pasture at all. He cuts and produces the feed, and so cattle, you know, cattle have lower food conversion efficiencies than chickens and pigs.
Interesting. So does the same thing apply, that it doesn't really matter what choices we make as a consumer, or would my stopping eating beef or eating beef one day a week make any difference if we all did it?
Well, if we all did it, probably yes. But your individual choice is really more about yourself and what you want to feel, rather than thinking you're going to change the world.
Should we worry about animal rights in terms of fisheries?
Well, in terms of fisheries and life, it's certainly an issue that's important to some people. My perspective, I actually come from a terrestrial background, and I've spent 6 months in Serengeti National Park when half of the animals died.
Yeah.
Okay, and so the fact is that every animal in the wild dies. And it's almost always a very unpleasant death. So, my personal perspective is that killing a fish, which I've done, is no worse death than what would have happened to them if I hadn't.
And okay, I think I need a nap now. I'm recovered from that. Tell me a little bit about your current thinking about the orca population around here.
Well, 5 years ago, I chaired an independent science review that the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Canadian government asked for on the impact of Chinook salmon fisheries on orcas. And what we found that really surprised us is, yes, Chinook is the dominant form of their food. Chinook has been becoming less abundant, but there are two groups of salmon-eating killer whales in Washington and British Columbia. The southern residents are the ones of big concern. The northern residents. The northern residents are doing great. Their population's been growing. There's 300 plus of them, and they fundamentally eat the same Chinook salmon that the lower. So the ones in Puget Sound, the southern residents, are subject to a lot more noise, they're subject to more ship traffic, they're subject to a lot of toxic substances in Puget Sound that probably the northern residents aren't. There's a little bit of difference in which Chinook salmon they eat. So I'm personally skeptical that Chinook salmon is the primary explanation for the decline and the problems that southern residents face. They've always been a small population. They're probably highly inbred. And they're just subject to a lot of threats, most of which we don't have much control over.
All right. Well, we appreciate your insight and your expertise.
Okay.
Thanks for
thanks very
talking
much.
to us about this.